lagi kali ya.
Ya.
Si Oka aja yang ngirimin apanya nanti ya, yang ngirimin itunya. Oka siap kan Kak ya? Oka?
Iya, Bu.
Ready ya untuk apanya ya? Oke, sip. Oke, harusnya kita punya 200 peserta hari ini. Mungkin karena terlalu pagi.
Ya salah, Pi, di Indonesia, Pi. Paling-paling pukul 8 nanti banyak bergabung tuh, Pi.
Mudah-mudahan. Oke, we are waiting for. Oke, Pak Gusti udah bergabung, Pak? Pak Gusti?
Kita belum terbiasa dengan pukul 7 itu memang Pi susah orang Indonesia. Apalagi Padang.
Ini bunyi HP siapa yang tang ting tung? Mungkin di silent kan HP-nya.
Iya.
Oke, mute aja semua, Kak.
Oke. Sudah? Ada Oka kan ya? Kak, tolong di unmute dan mute-nya ya, Kak. Cynthia, are you ready, Cin? Kita masih punya 2 menit lagi. Ada Pak Purwo juga ya, pagi Pak Purwo.
Ya, bagi Bu, bagi.
Oke. Oke. Cynthia ready ya? Oke. 74 yang lain. Ini sebuah hal yang apa? Si Jup yang teman-teman lain juga belum bergabung. Ini ada teman yang dari Oke, yang teman dari Amerika juga belum bergabung ya. Ravando ada? Ada. Pagi ada Ravando juga. Pagi Ravando.
Selamat pagi Bu, apa kabar?
Kabar baik. Akhirnya kita bertemu Ravando. Di sini ada Pak Hans. Pak Hans, ini ada Ravando. Kemudian Vando, kami juga ada Prof Gusti di sini. Prof dua di antara profesor kami di jurusan sejarah. Ravando adalah penulis buku sejarah influenza ya, perang dengan influenza kalau saya tidak salah. Terus kemudian ada ketua prodi Pak Anatona dan moderator kita hari ini Ibu Dr. Diah dan beberapa dosen dari prodi juga hadir. Ada Pak Purwosodo, ada Pak Armansah. Kemudian kami ada Pak Dekan 2 kami, Pak Rumbardi, dan Dekan 1 kami, Pak Gusdi Sastra. Cukup banyak dan kami merasa kami sangat senang ada Pak Hans, ada Pak Ravando hadir, ada berbagi untuk bagaimana belajar sejarah dari pandemi yang tidak berkesudahan ini. Gitu, Vando silakan saling menyapa Vando sebelum kita mulai, Ravando.
Ya, selamat pagi Bapak Ibu semua. Salam dari Melbourne. Tetangganya Pak Hans ini di sini. Senang sekali sudah bisa diundang, sudah diperkenankan untuk berbagi. Semoga sehat-sehat selalu, semoga pandemi ini juga cepat berlalu sehingga kita bisa beraktivitas normal seperti sedia kala. Terima kasih sekali lagi Bu Yeni atas undangannya, Bapak Ibu sekalian atas kesempatannya. Saya akan ikut full mudah-mudahan selama 3 hari ke depan.
Makasih Vando. Walaupun kita tidak pernah bertemu muka ya.
Iya, tapi sudah saling kenal dari nama dan karena mungkin dunia sejarah itu skill jadinya sama-sama sudah tahu.
Iya betul. Ini manfaat jaringan saya pikir Vando. Kalau berteman dengan teman dan kita mengenal temannya teman. Alhamdulillah ternyata
Iya.
Pando mau berbagi dan membantu kita semua di sini.
Terima kasih juga undangannya, Bu.
Sudah 82 peserta saya pikir, dan kita bagaimana Nidia?
Ya.
Pak Anatona, kita cek dulu Pak Rumbardi, coba Pak Rumbardi.
Halo.
Oke.
Lagi Bu Pi, kedengaran ya?
Dengaran Pak Rum. Di sini ada Pak Hans, keynote speaker kita yang sudah
Good morning,
meluangkan
Pak Han.
waktu.
Good morning in Indonesia.
Selamat pagi.
Selamat pagi.
Oke, berarti Pak Rumbardi, kita udah mau mulai. Pak Gusdi dan Prof Gusti.
Silakan Ibu Eni.
Selamat pagi Pak Gusti. Kita keynote speaker kita sudah ada. Kita juga Fando dari Melbourne juga sudah ada. Kita sedang menunggu yang teman yang dari Amerika. Mudah-mudahan bisa cepat bergabung. Kemudian mungkin kita akan mulai dalam beberapa, mungkin 1-2 menit lagi. Cynthia sudah siap? Are you ready, Cint? Cynthia, suaranya nggak kedengeran, nak sayang?
Yes, ma'am.
Oke, suaranya ya. Oke. Cynthia ini salah satu pemenang dari Duta Genre. Jadi anak pinter, cantik, dan pemenang dari Duta Genre dengan kemampuan Inggris, alhamdulillah, yang bisa membantu kita hari ini. Oke, saya serahkan. Saya pikir kita sudah 88 orang, mungkin kemudian bisa bergabung karena yang mendaftar sudah hampir 200 orang. Mudah-mudahan bisa cepat bergabung. Oke, kita bisa mulai mungkin. Nidia, ready? Ya. Pak Rum, Pak Anatona?
Ready.
Oke, Oka, are you ready? Oka?
Ya, Bu.
Oke, jangan lupa nanti untuk Indonesia Rayanya ya. Oke, sip. Cynthia, you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Oke.
Siap.
Time is you. Pak Hans, ready, Pak?
Siap.
Siap. Oke, siap. Siap. Mantap.
Ya.
Oke, Cynthia, the floor is yours. Come in, Cynthia. Silakan.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opening ceremony is going to start in 5 minutes. Please be seated. Let me introduce myself first. I am Cynthia Mutiarazeni, and I will be the master of the ceremony today. Let us start the function. First, and we will open this icon-held conference with the Indonesian national anthem. First, let us start this event by saying Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, Professor Hans Paul and Associate Professor Rebecca Fanani BA Hans MS PhD RS as the speaker today. Participants and ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, let us say thanks to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala who has given us guidance, happiness, health, and mercy so we can attain and participate in this special event without any obstacles. Praise and salutation upon our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who had brought us to the path of light from the darkness in this life. Good morning, and we are delighted to welcome you to this meeting room for the opening ceremony of Virtual International Conference History of Health in Asia, History Department, Faculty of Humanities of Andalas University, Padang, Indonesia, on the 15th October 2020. It is an honor to me to inform you that among us we have first the Vice Dean to Administration and Finance Affairs, Faculty of Humanities of Andalas University, Mr. Rumbardi MSc. Next, we have Mr. Anatona M. Hum as the Head of History Department, Faculty of Humanities, Andalas University. And also we have the Chairperson of Organizing Committee, History Department, Faculty of Humanities of Andalas University. And also the moderator of this session, Mrs. Diah Jahaya Iman, MLit, PhD. And for all the participants and all the students of History Department. The first event is opening by the Master of the Ceremony, and the next event is welcoming speech by the Head of Organizing Committee Department, Faculty of Humanities of Andalas University, to Mrs. Yeni Narni, SSMA, PhD. You might take the floor.
Thank you, Cynthia. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Praise be to God who has given us His grace and blessing so that we can attend this conference. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Honorable Vice Dean of Administration and Finance Affairs, Faculty of Humanity, Andalas University, Pak Rumbardi, MSc, and Head of History Department, Faculty of Humanity, Andalas University, Bapak Dr. Anatona M. Hum. I would like to welcome our distinguished keynote speaker, Prof. Hans Paul, and Ibu Dr. Rebecca Fanani, Dr. Diah Pitaloka, Dr. Yap Bini, and the featured speaker, Mr. Ravando, Mr. Juprianto, and Novel Noviandri. And the presenter who will to share that knowledge and research outcome with all of us today. And the last but not least, all participants from Indonesia and overseas attending this event today. I would like to thank the committee who have worked so hard to make this event happen today. In this opportunity, let me share you a brief story and background of this international conference. During the uncertain situation because of the pandemic, we faced with many problems. Face-to-face discussion become extremely limited, if not forbidden, due to physical distancing. Consequently, the spirit and enthusiasm to build network, both national and international level, through seminar or other scientific meeting are limited. At the Department of History, we see webinar has solution, as we believe that as academicians, it is our duty to remain concerned in developing network and science despite the difficult situation. We believe that the passion to share knowledge and establish cooperation must be maintained and developed continuously. And thanks to the development of the information technology in our era, we are able to do that. This activity hopefully can run synergistically and involve lecturer and student both in the term of planning and implementation. It is our hope that this activity will be carried out continuously every year. That was a brief description of the course of this conference. Before I end my speech, let me share some information of our upcoming event, which we call Lecturer Program Series. The first lecturer program was already held on October 10 with speaker Prof. Robert Cribb from Australian National University. At the end of October, we will hold another lecturer program with Dr. Annie Polman from the Queensland University. And at the beginning of November, lecturer program will be featured by Mrs. Amurwani, Dwi Lestari Ningsi, and Prof. Gusti Asnan. And you can participate in this program. In this uncertain and hard situation, we have great challenges and great opportunities. And with your help, we can deal with them and maintain the enthusiasm in academic life. I think that's all from me. Let me close this speech with wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much to Mrs. Yeni Narni. It was a delighting welcoming speech from Mrs. Yeni Narni. Now, we're going to the next event. We will hear welcoming speech by Head of History Department, Faculty of Humanities of Andalas University. To Mr. Anatona, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Cynthia, for the time. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good morning to the keynote speakers and all participants. First of all, I would like to say welcome to all of us on virtual Zoom in the International Conference on History of Health in Asia, held by History Department, Faculty of Humanities, Andalas University in Padang, West Sumatra Province, Indonesia. Then I would also like to say to all of us, wherever we are now, in a good, healthy, and condition during this COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, this event is an effort to keep the academic atmosphere alive on the campus, especially in the History Department, Faculty of Humanities. Before this, in June and July 2020, the History Department had also conducted several national-scale webinars with various interesting topics by inviting experts who are skilled in their fields. Then, on last Saturday, we have launched a new program in the department named Lecturer Program by presenting both from Indonesia and foreigner speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the head of History Department Andalas University, we would like to many thanks to Bapak Professor Hans Pols, a health historian of the University of Sydney, and Ibu Associate Professor Rebecca Fanani of Central Queensland University, Australia. We also would like to thanks to all the other speakers, includes Mas Rafando and others who are going to present their paper in 3 days conference. We also express our gratitude to all the participants from various institutions in Indonesia, including lecturers and students from several universities in Padang, such as University Negeri Padang, UNP, UIN Imam Bonjol, STKIP, PGRI, and of course, the Andalas University as a host, who is joining this event. Finally, we would like to thank to the Bapak Dr. Gusdi Sastra as Vice Dean of Academic Affairs and Pak D.R.S. Rumbardi MA as Vice Dean of Administration and Finance Affairs Faculties of Humanities, Andalas University, who have supported this event, and special thanks to our colleague, Mrs. Yeni Narni, PhD, who organized the event as a chairperson. Hopefully, the event ran well. Have a nice conference. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much to Mr. Anatona. You have delivered an enlightening speech. The following address is the speech from the Vice Dean to Administration and Finance Faculty of Humanities of Andalas University. And also, we will start the day one session for the international conference by his speech. To Mr. Rumbardi, MSc, the time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, all. The Honorable Rector of Andalas University, I think if he is present, the Honorable Dean and Vice Deans of Faculty of Humanities, Mr. Gusdi is present this morning, the Honorable Chairman, Secretary, and all lecturers of the Department of History, Andalas University, and the steering committee of the conference. Your Excellencies, our keynote speakers, Professor Hans Puls from Sydney University, Associate Professor Rebecca Fanani from Central Queensland University, Y. Bimni, MD from United States of America, Daya Pitaloka, PhD from Aranin Institute Scholarship, New Jersey, USA, and Yeni Narni, PhD from Andalas University. We thank for your participation in this international conference in these several days. We also would like to express our gratitude to all lecturers, students, and participants who are joining in this conference from all over the country in Indonesia and from all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, we thank God that this morning we can conduct or we can hold an international conference on history of health in Asia, as organized by the Department of History, Faculty of Humanities, Andalas University. We wish God bless all of us for the success of this program. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Dr. Hasanuddin, is not in position to be with us this morning because at the same time, with the opening of this conference, he is attending another activity that has been scheduled earlier than this event. Therefore, I am Rumbardi, Vice Dean. On behalf of the Dean, will give this opening speech. I would like to convey the Dean's message that he greatly appreciates this conference, and he expects that his absence in this conference will not reduce the meaning of this conference. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of the conference is very interesting and really reflects the context of the global condition today. The world community is facing the health threat, which is called COVID-19 pandemic. The threats and the impact of this pandemic are extraordinary because it does not only cause the health vulnerability and mass death, but also force the change in conventional life practice. And moreover, this pandemic also ravages the world economy and also influence the order of law, politics, social, and culture. This conference, indeed, will bring us to look back at the history of human civilization in coping with their health threats from the past times to today. As it is mentioned in the scope and the topic of the conference today, the topic will deal much with the health, such as health and natural disaster, manuscript and pandemic, traditional health practitioners and pandemics, modern health practitioners and pandemics, disease and resilience, photography, film, pandemics, local wisdom and pandemics, urban areas and pandemics, and rural areas and pandemics. All of those topics reflects what we need to see in this conference. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we hope that this conference will be able to reveal various scientific potentials, technology, and local genius to be studied here and to be developed in order to contribute to the handling of the recent and future pandemics. I think this will be the most contribution of the conference. From the point of view history, science, this conference is expected as a trigger or an eye-opener for the society that the history science does not only deal with public figures, political heroes, cultures, but it is a fact that the history science also deal with the society's real problems, such as natural disaster, disease plague, and disease handling practices. Many cases about mishandling of the disaster have caused many victims because the society forgets the history and their local wisdom. For example, we can see in Aceh tsunami. This tsunami had claimed a lot of victims because the people of because they forget their ancestors' local wisdom on how to anticipate the tsunami. The same thing also happens in other sectors of life that cannot be separated from the history, culture, and civilization. All right, ladies and gentlemen, now I think we cannot wait for the presentations from our keynote speakers. Therefore, I would like to end my opening speech. And now, by saying Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, I officially declare that this conference open. Finally, I would like to thank all committee who have worked hard to prepare and to organize this conference. Last but not least, my gratitude also goes to all keynote speakers, featured speakers, and all participants of this conference. I wish all of us good luck. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much to Mr. Rumberdi, MSc. It was a delighting opening speech from Mr. Rumberdi, MSc. And now, the International Conference History of Health in Asia is about to start. I am Cynthia Mutiarazeni. As the MC today, just want to say, from the deepest of my heart, I do apologize for my mistakes in presenting the ceremony. Thank you very much for all of your attention and goodbye. See you then. And I will lead the moderator to lead this session. To Mrs. Diah Cahaya Iman M. PhD, time is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Cynthia. First of all, I would say good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce, my name is Diah Cahaya Iman. I'm your moderator for the first session of International Conference of History of Health in Asia. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here in this webinar. This morning, we have the honor of hearing the great speakers, Professor Hans Pols and Associate Professor Rebecca Fanani. Both of them are from Australia, and where I also studied from my master's degree. This presentation are very important to all of us, as the Vice Dean has mentioned, because we are in this pandemic of COVID-19, and it has been affecting different people in different ways. I would like to invite the first speaker, Professor Hans Pols, and I would like to read Professor Hans Pols' biodata. And I just read an article that Professor Hans' mother was born in Jakarta. Am I right? That's really great. It's like President Obama, like he has a connection with Indonesia and Jakarta. That's really interesting. Professor Pauls does his research in the history of medicine and with a focus on the Dutch East Indies and Indonesia. Professor Pauls is particularly interested in the history of psychiatry and mental health. And he was born in a village, Groningen, the Netherlands. Yeah, I hope I pronounced this word correctly. And he received his doctorandus. Yeah, this is because in Netherlands you use doctorandus, like Indonesia when we graduated also. Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. And it is interesting to know that Professor Paul has a unique historical with Indonesia. Professor Pauls received his master's degree in York University, Toronto, Canada. So it seems that Professor Pauls has been around. Yeah, he received his master's degree also from the University of Pennsylvania. This is a very beautiful campus. I went there before. Professor Pauls has, you know, because he's really the expert for his field and has many citations already, and the high index is pretty high. That's really impressive. Yeah. So what we are going to do today, I will let the presenter to present their presentation, and after that we will have the question and answer session. You can send your question in the chat, so the host will share it. Jadi ada yang bertanya, nanti silakan tuliskan pertanyaan di chat. Nanti hostnya akan men-share itu dalam bentuk slide, dan moderator akan menerjemahkan kalau itu di dalam bahasa Indonesia. Tapi saya yakin Profesor Paul juga bisa membacanya kalau dalam bahasa Indonesia. Kemudian bisa ditulis dalam bahasa Indonesia, nanti saya akan menerjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Inggris. So I will translate it into English. And the title of Professor Hans Paul's presentation today is Epidemics and History in Indonesia and Elsewhere. So Professor Paul, you got 20 minutes. I'm sorry to interrupt you in case like you have 3 minutes before the time is over. And now time is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And there are advantages to COVID, since you can bring an international group of people together like this much more easily. So I think we have a possibility to intensify our intellectual exchanges worldwide. And that is a wonderful thing. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the honor of letting me give this short address. Epidemics and history. Now, yes, epidemics are fascinating. Now we are in the middle of a pandemic, and of course our reaction right now is it's not all that fascinating. It's actually really sad. It limits our interaction. It limits what we can do in everyday life, and a lot of people we know have died. Nonetheless, from a historical, sociological, anthropological, and ethnographic perspective, they are fascinating. They're an analytical tool, a lens, or a sampling device. Francis Bacon, one of the first people to talk about the scientific method, said, to know nature, it's like, how do you get to know a lion? You squeeze in its tail. Because if a lion is asleep, you don't never get to really know the lion. And all of you who have cats at home, try this. When it's asleep, squeeze it in the tail and you will get to know your cat much better. So epidemics, pandemics are always going together with fear, strong fear, of diversity of social reactions, medical reactions, and government reactions, and individual reactions. There is an abundance of what we today call fake news or hoaxes. There are various kinds of religious reactions, and many groups will try to use an epidemic for their own advantage. This is, of course, not the most beautiful trait of human nature, but we can see this happen. What we have seen throughout the centuries is there's always a search for a scapegoat. Whenever the Black Death broke out in Europe, it was the Jews who were poisoning the wells. A lot in the world, lots of places that Chinese have been blamed for, well, because they were a minority. In China, they will blame some other minority group, or individuals with leprosy, heathens, Kafirs, non-believers. Pick your favorite marginalized group, and they tend to be blamed. Stigmatization and marginalization tends to become more extreme during epidemics, just because it's a reaction to anxiety. We see a variety of explanations. Some people say it's a lack of religious devotion. Some people say it's an ignorance. People don't know about hygiene. They're being primitive. Ravanda will tell you that in Dutch East Indies time, the Dutch said, the Indonesians are so primitive, of course they get sick. Sadly, in Indonesia, that explanation still holds, applied to certain social groups. Then there are a variety of medical explanations. And of course, with the Spanish flu and the beginning of COVID, we didn't quite know what this COVID thing was. The development of knowledge around the nature of COVID was unusually strong and fast. Hoaxes come up with all kind of other explanations because we feel better in a bad world if we can explain why things are like that. So we can blame the bully, we can blame Donald Trump, let's do that. It doesn't change anything, but somehow it gives us a feeling of being in control. Pandemics and epidemics also expose us to the potential power of governments. The greatest power governments have is in relation to health interventions. When a government says all of Jakarta is closed, you cannot go anywhere because of COVID, people tend to accept it. If they say it's to fight terror, it's a little bit different. So quarantine, to impose compulsory quarantine, the whole question of compulsory vaccinations or other measures comes up, and it leads us to the question, what is the limit of the power of governments? What can governments ask us to do legitimately and what not? The big question for governments is, do we focus on the economy or on health? Or do we try to focus on both at the same time? The best way to stop COVID is to force everybody to stay home for 3 months. This is not feasible. People will starve and the economy will die. So there's always a negotiation. What factor is the most important? And we see right now, we have a fantastic comparative experiment in which different governments around the world have chosen different options. New Zealand said health is the most important, so they stopped everything, closed the borders. The UK and the US have said the economy is more important, so we see a lot of COVID there. It's also a really revealing act in showing who has power and who are the most powerless people in society, because they tend to get more disempowered in an epidemic. Who is affected most? Well, in general, there is a strong correlation between disease and socioeconomic status, or an inverse correlation between health and health status and socioeconomic status. The poor tend to suffer the most. Staying at home is good if you have a nice and large home, if you can order the Gojek to bring you the food. But if you have to go to the pasar to sell a little bit of food or other things to make a living, you cannot afford to stay at home. And your home would be quite small as well. Learning from home is great if you have sufficient, if you have a laptop, a good internet connection. So poorer workers, the workers who do the Gojek, tend to be far more exposed. And this, I think, when we think about measures to be taken to alleviate the effects of COVID, we need to keep in mind. What we learn from epidemics like this is also the limits of human interventions. Our interventions do not always have the effect we like. It also shows off the level of political will or the lack thereof. And sometimes diseases just peter out, because most of the genetic variations we see in any type of disease make it less powerful. So sometimes it just goes away. If it's because of herd immunity or other factors, that depends. Every epidemic is unique. But sometimes it passes without us doing anything. This is an image depicting an epidemic, I think in Italy in the Middle Ages, and you can see it is a deplorable sight. We see lots of dead people, people in a state of desperation, trying to do something. Or, as was common at the time, the wealthy people would flee the cities, which is a great way of spreading an epidemic. And the poor people had to stay in the cities. Here we see a doctor, or is it a quack, protecting himself against the Black Death through a crazy costume, by smoking, by having clouds of smoke around him. Today we know this is superstition, but back then this was a general belief. People will do whatever it takes to ward off disease, however mistaken this is. Pandemics can make you wealthy. If you offer a cure, even if it doesn't work, even if it's a fake cure, like, a string of eucalypt leaves on a little string for around the neck, people will try it because we want to avoid disease and death at all price. This is an image of the Spanish flu in Kansas, where it started. It's actually not the Spanish, but the American flu, but the Americans didn't like it that way. Let's look at a bunch of epidemics or pandemics that have affected Indonesia and the Dutch East Indies over time. Smallpox came around after the Portuguese and the Dutch and others started to explore the region. It is imported from Europe. Europeans had built up immunity over centuries. Why? Because Europeans started this very strange habit of living in cities. Cities used to be absolutely filthy. That meant that from birth, Europeans were exposed to a wide variety of germs and could build up immunity. Or through genetic variations, those who could withstand the disease would survive, others would die. So Europeans were not terribly affected by smallpox. Then they go to North and South America, to Asia, to Australia, and it spreads like a wildfire. Mortality rates can be up to 30%, much higher for babies. In the Dutch East Indies, they started vaccination campaigns. You take a little bit from pus from a cowpox, you scratch it. It has to happen every 5 years, which probably has been quite effective. Some pandemics, the lesson from smallpox and other diseases is it follows trade routes. It follows routes of human mobility in a new global world. And of course, our world became global after Columbus was the first European who discovered America. And an intense exchange of goods and people followed. And of course, in our day, this is more intense than ever. Here we see some Dr. Jawas doing these inoculations. Dr. Jawa in a village doing the same thing. This is in a laboratory of the Eichmann Institute making these vaccinations. Smallpox is endemic in the area, not anymore, fortunately. The reaction among Indonesians was fear and fatalism because nobody really knew quite how to avoid it. And the belief was it couldn't be avoided. So compulsion, the vaccinations were compulsory at the time. This is the nature of colonial society. You don't ask the natives whether they want to be vaccinated. You call in the army and line them up. No public health education. But medical intervention has resolved it. Smallpox can affect you. You can live years after it. You get disfigured. Cholera is quite different and quite scary. Cholera came to the Dutch East Indies repeatedly. It can kill you in a matter of hours. Symptoms are severe dehydration through vomiting and diarrhea. People start to look completely blue, their lymph glands turn black, and within a few hours it can be over. The origin is generally assumed to be the Ganges Delta in India. And again, it is transmitted through travel, and more specifically through water. If people start vomiting or have severe diarrhea, if it ends up in the drinking water, then everything is lost. That is the way it spreads. So the call was if, and this started in Europe, but also in the Dutch East Indies, if we have fresh drinking water that is disease-free, if we have sewers, because in the good old days, the rivers and the streams and the Kali were both the source of fresh drinking water and public toilets, and that, in the case of cholera, is really bad. In the city of Semarang, there were lots of attempts to get that fresh drinking water, not just to Europeans, but also to the Kampung. And that was quite effective. So no more cholera in Semarang, lots of cholera after that in Surabaya because they didn't want to spend the money, and a little bit in the middle in Batavia because they spent a little bit of money. We see lots of initiatives in Semarang after 1910. Kampung improvement, this is before and this is after. The fear in Europe and North America was that cholera traveled internationally. And well, I can point it out. It started in the Ganges Delta, then it would go up the coast to China, to Indonesia, and then it could also go through the Middle East and initially through this route to Europe. But when the Suez Canal opened in 1869, it could go directly there. This is the way it traveled. Now, if Europeans were thinking, who could we blame for this? It was, of course, the Muslim pilgrims on the Hajj, because they would come from all these areas, specifically Indonesia, of course, what is now Pakistan, go up there. Muslims could come from the other direction. And okay, I'll just continue. So the belief was, okay, this is the source of the spread. I'm not saying it is, but this was generally believed. What did I do in the Dutch East Indies? Onrust Island, or Pulau Onrust on the coast of Batavia, became there for quarantine. See some more pictures. It's still there. Not the buildings are not in surgical state anymore. Here we see a very typical effect. What we see in epidemics is that the rules apply differently to Europeans and Indonesians. Europeans normally could get through, except if the ship had cases of cholera, they had to raise a yellow flag, and yes, then there was quarantine. If that is not the case, Europeans could post a bond, 100 guilders, and they got it back if they visited their physician who could declare they were healthy or not. This was way too much money for Indonesians. All Indonesians who came back from the Hajj had to be on Pulau Onrust for a month to make sure they wouldn't transmit this. So health regulations are often in the name of health, but they're always applied on the basis of race, nationality, gender, socioeconomic class. For example, the Australian border is closed today, but if you're an Australian citizen, you can come to Australia. Now, that is an argument not based on anything to do with health, but clearly some other things. Cholera was a very sudden threat, could kill in a matter of hours, caused a lot of anxiety, people fleeing the city if they could afford it. Lots of protective devices, charms, prayers, trying to fend off the disease, blaming of India or China or whatever comes to mind, blaming the lack of hygiene, and that is of course correct, but then we're talking about personal hygiene. The natives are dirty, so therefore they are to blame themselves. Sadly, the cholera was the most deadly for the poor because of their low level of health, their low level of nutrition. And I already emphasized the differential measures. The Spanish flu, sorry for my telephone, affected us worldwide, but we have the world expert on the Spanish flu in the audience who will talk tomorrow, so I can skip that. The last epidemic that plagued the Dutch East Indies, well, several more, but an important one is the plague, what was called in Europe in the Middle Ages, the Black Death. And that spreads through rats or mice. Normally, the mosquitoes that spread it are happy to infect rats, but when all the rats are sick, then they go to human beings. And indeed, it can be quite lethal. It came to the Dutch East Indies in 1912 on a ship with rice from Rangoon that shipped in Surabaya. Famous Pahlawan national Cipto Mangunkusumo volunteered to go to the Malang area where it was really, really bad. The big question the Dutch asked, well, where do rats live? In houses, often in the bamboo that houses are made of, houses of Indonesians. So you get again a program of kampung improvement. This is what happened. If you had the symptoms of the plague, you were put in internment. So the effect of this, quite predictably, is if you have symptoms, hide and don't tell anyone. We see this in Ebola in Africa, because people believe that once you are interned like that, you will for sure die. So from a health perspective, there's a good motive to do this. But once people find out about it, this is not going to be effective. Treating houses with sulfur to try to kill all the rats. Well, this is, sulfur has the smell of rotten eggs, well known to Indonesians that if you climb a volcano that's still active, it's that smell. So I'm not sure how your house smells after that. Or just destroy all the houses. You see here the roof is made of bamboo, and bamboo is just, see, rats love it, they live in it. So the Dutch said, let's destroy all those houses, we erect new ones. That's a great idea. But of course, villagers were just kicked out of a house and said, okay, come back in 6 months and you got a new house. Yeah, where would they go in the meantime? Not entirely clear. So those measures were often arbitrary and discriminatory. Nonetheless, housing improvement is a good idea, but unfortunately, it led also to malaria. Because if you dig up the ground, if you have new ditches, you have lots of places for mosquitoes to procreate and have their larvae, so it leads to malaria. So another measure was you would reward a cent, 1 rupiah for every rat that's caught, because if you get rid of the rats, no more cholera. And then lots of Indonesian boys started rat farms, because the more rats you bring in, the more money you get. Vaccination became available in 1927, and that was really helpful in putting an end to this.
Professor Paul, you got 3 minutes more.
3 minutes, okay. Malaria is still a problem in most of this world. It's also spread by mosquitoes, many different kinds. For the physicians among you, this is how it goes. In the Dutch East Indies, of course, there was quinine. The Dutch East Indies had almost a world monopoly on quinine, which is very good in suppressing the symptoms. Now, in the 50s, you had these big campaigns with DDT trying to kill all these mosquitoes, as is done right here. My student Vivek Nalakantan wrote about this in this book. Read it, buy it. We all know the effect DDT. The mosquitoes build up resistance, and the disease could still go on. Most people are not aware they have it, but it saps energy and productivity. Today, only preventive measures like Kampung will help. The pharmaceutical industry is not interested in finding a cure because you could sell it only to poor countries, so you cannot make big money out of it. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are pretty much the only sources of funding for this kind of research, but it is a pretty tough one to solve. To conclude, epidemics and pandemics are unusually revealing. It reveals the state of knowledge in medicine, or the lack of our knowledge, or sometimes in the past that physicians were wrong about things, but people act on the basis of this knowledge, or at least physicians. Then there is the nature of government and the type of intervention that is proposed. Sometimes governments are neglectful, sometimes they're overly forceful by imposing quarantines. Sometimes they also focus on public health education. And as we all know, we have dispensers with sanitizers everywhere, and wash your hands, avoid crowds. This is, of course, a key in beating this epidemic. Public reactions, scapegoating, intolerance, hoaxes, fake cures, lots of anxiety, but also a lot of public mobilization. One village in Java, people dressed up like ghosts and sat around at night. So the villagers were scared and stayed at home. Now, I think that is very, very creative. Would that be in Padang as well? Are people afraid of ghosts? Maybe this would be an effective measure. So hoaxes everywhere. This is worldwide. This also we see in Indonesia. Blaming and scapegoating is everywhere. Talk about false cures. People want to make a quick buck. But also unusual innovation and creative reactions. Some small villages, desa, just closed themselves off or introduced their own measures, mostly because of the central government in Indonesia only introducing a limited amount of measures. For teaching history of medicine, of course, students always say, well, why is health and disease important in history? Now you don't need to convince anyone. It is. we have a comparative experiment. We see governments reacting very differently, leading to very different outcomes. To which extent do they listen to the science, to medicine? To which extent do they emphasize health or the economy? In Indonesia, sadly, the central government's response, well, I shouldn't be judgmental, right? I would say there is room for improvement, but there is a lot of local initiative to fill that gap. And I think there's a lot of initiative locally also to fight the hoaxes, to make accurate health information available, which is extremely valuable. So we see a lot of new things in Indonesia, worldwide, in trying for all of us to get through this pandemic. And let me close.
Yeah.
Semoga sehat selalu. Terima kasih.
That's really very good timing, Professor Pauls. Thank you very much for the very informative and very impressive presentation. What I would like to remind the audience and participants, if you would like to ask questions to Professor Pauls, now we can keep it, but I'm just wondering whether Ibu Rebecca is already here.
Iya, Ibu Becky ada. Ibu Rebecca.
Okay. All right. So, selamat pagi, Ibu Profesor Rebecca Fanani. Saya Dia. Bertemu lagi kita.
Yeah.
Sorry. Ada timing yang berbunyi di sini. Siapa yang berpunya?
Oke. Tolong.
Oke. Siapa yang punya bunyi?
Oke, tolong yang lain tolong dimatikan, tolong. Oke, silakan nih dia.
Oke. Apa yang bunyi? Saya punya pasti tidak bunyi. Okay. Before we start, I would like to introduce Associate Professor Rebecca Fanani. She's from the Center of Queensland University. Ibu Rebecca is I don't know whether it is still the director of the Diploma of Languages, and she has been like teaching more than 20 years. So it's really a great experience, and we are lucky to have Ibu Rebecca here with us today. And she studied at University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, then Schools of Public Health also in Minneapolis, and then University of Tasmania, for her PhD. And her original training is public health and was in the field of environmental and occupational health. And you are registered as sanitarian. Is it right, Professor?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and she worked in compliance of the state and federal level in the United States before entering the academic environment in Australia, while she remained interested in the aspect of public health. And she worked mostly in the areas of cultural and consonant and the impact of language and culture issues and the experience of health and illness. She has like very impressive citations and high index, and according to the ResearchGate, I've checked that. And some books has been published also the same with Professor Pauls. Really interesting books and articles. Today, the presentation of Ibu Rebecca is the impact of pandemics throughout history. So before we start, I'm just going to remind the audience again, you can keep you can write your questions and in Indonesia, or I will translate it into English, put it in the chat. So after that, host will share it in the screen later on. Okay, Ibu Rebecca, you may start.
Okay, thank you for that very nice introduction, and it's nice to see everyone here. Before I start, I'll just apologize in advance because I'm in between meetings, so I will give the paper and then I will have to go and do that. I'll also tell you by way of background that I am from public health, and what I'm going to talk about today comes from a public health background. So let me just share the screen with you, and we'll get started. Now, as announced, I'm talking about the impact of pandemics throughout history, but from a public health perspective. And keeping in mind, a public health perspective is a little bit different than the way straight historians look at things or the way other fields that might be interested in these things think about it. Now, we need to understand when we think about disease that really epidemic disease is as old as human beings. As long as there have been people living in societies, living in groups, they have experienced disease. Probably as many of us are aware, there are many sources of disease in the world. For us, many of our new diseases come from animal reservoirs, but sometimes we generate them ourselves. When we talk about a pandemic, such as the one that generated interest in this conference, we're talking about an outbreak of disease that covers several regions or areas, possibly even the whole world. Pandemics are not new. They're not something that just came about now in the 21st century, even though we haven't heard that much about them before. And we need to understand that our own actions, our attitudes, our behaviors, things that we consider normal, things that we consider unusual, have been shaped as much by our experience of disease as they have by the other kinds of events that historians are often interested in. We know historians are often interested in wars, in political developments, things of that kind, but in fact, disease is just as influential and has often come along with those other kinds of developments, as I will show you in a couple of examples. But the thing that we need to remember is that disease is always with us. It is much more usual for us to experience various kinds of illness than it is for us not to be subject to those things. And this is perhaps something that we've forgotten in this modern context. Now, here I'm going to show you a list of a few pandemics. There are many more. These are not the most important ones, but this just reminds us how far back these things go. And certainly many of us here are interested in history. They're interested in the history of medicine. So we know about a lot of these things. What is interesting, though, is many of these ancient pandemics in particular, we don't really know what disease they were. That is certainly true for the plague of Athens. That's the first one I have on here. This is getting to be, more than 2,000 years ago. And as you note, it took place during a war between Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece. About 100,000 people were killed at the time over a period of a number of years, and that was an awful lot of people going back that long ago. But we know that wars are one of the things that often are associated with epidemic disease, probably because we have groups of people who wouldn't ordinarily meet, being in the same place at the same time, often moving into new areas where they haven't been before, and living under conditions that are very difficult in terms of food, shelter, water, things of that kind. Sometime after that, what has come to be called the Antonine Plague took place. That was quite long. It was brought back to the Roman Empire by returning soldiers. Looking at it now, we feel that this might have been smallpox, but of course we don't really know. That one killed about 5 million people in the Roman Empire, and the reason I wanted to mention it to you is because by many historians, this is considered to be a major cause of the fall of the Roman Empire. Obviously, an empire such as the Romans doesn't come to an end just like that. It kind of disintegrates over a long period of time. But this plague was considered to be one of the factors that led directly to that. At some point later, the plague of Cyprian emerged. This again was an unknown disease that killed as many as 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. And we might be wondering, why were so many of these very early epidemics, pandemics, whatever we want to call them, associated with the Roman Empire? Well, for a very obvious reason that we are all familiar with now in the context of public health, and that was because there were a large number of people there. It was the area of highest population density at that time, and where you have lots of people, you have lots of illness. We're all familiar with the Black Death. I think we just heard about that in the previous presentation. This, in fact, refers to several episodes of epidemic bubonic plague that came to Europe from Asia. And again, this was an interesting one because a very large part of the population was killed in many locations. Now, what was interesting about this and what I want to draw your attention to is what happened to the survivors. Well, a lot of people did survive, and many people whose situation had been economically quite difficult, socially perhaps at the bottom of the social gradient before that, found that they had an opportunity for upward mobility because so many other people were gone and it was possible to do things that had not been available to them before. And their economic and social situation improved dramatically. And the reason I want to point that out is because one impact of a pandemic is that often it changes the social structure, and perhaps this is something that we will see when the current coronavirus situation dies down. Pandemics and so forth were not limited to Europe. There was a very big one in the 1500s in Central America. This is estimated to have killed about 15 million people. This was some type of viral hemorrhagic fever, but of course we don't know exactly what it was or whether perhaps it's still around. But one thing we do know about diseases of this kind is that they tend to become less serious over time. So it is possible that diseases like this that were new at the time have become less dangerous and perhaps more commonplace. Moving far forward into the 20th century, I will draw your attention to the American polio epidemic that began in New York in 1916. This one was perhaps not as big as some of the other ones that we've been talking about, but it was very significant because it was comparatively modern. And this was in the tail end of this was when American President Franklin Roosevelt contracted polio. And we know that this was important in American history. Polio has been important in world history. And this was the epidemic of disease that led to the push to develop the polio vaccine that we are aware did not become available until the 1960s. All right, so that was just a very quick overview of some of the epidemics and pandemics that have been significant in human history. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about a couple of others to illustrate the point here that when we look at things from a public health point of view, we see that disease causes enormous change that is very significant in the ongoing state of health of whole populations. So we're all familiar with the Spanish flu, as it was called, which actually had nothing to do with Spain or the Spanish, but that was its name, that began in 1918 as World War I was ending. Now, in fact, the best scholarship on this suggests that probably this influenza epidemic began in the United States. What we do know, though, is that it came to human beings from the form of avian influenza from birds. And in fact, many of our human influenzas come from a bird reservoir. And by the time it died down a couple of years later, it was estimated to have killed about 150 million people worldwide. Now, if you're familiar with the news today, you know that a lot of the things we worry about when we talk about public health are non-health factors that have the ability to affect people's state of health. One of the most important of those is socioeconomic status. We know that people who have low income, low access to resources tend to be sicker, they have worse outcomes from illness, and they have a more varied and more complex state of health. Well, the epidemic of influenza in 1918 reduced real GDP in all of the affected countries around the world by an average of 6%. Now imagine that. Disease in this case had a massive economic effect that affected people not just then, but for many years into the future. On the other hand, this epidemic led into the Roaring 20s, which was very important culturally and was very dynamic, but economically it was devastating. It led to something else that was very interesting, and that was social disruption. This influenza pandemic was interesting, and it remains interesting because it disproportionately killed young people. Now, that is not usual for a respiratory illness, and it is not usual for influenza. We don't know why this was the case, but it was for some reason. But It also led to the collapse of healthcare systems around the world. And in all of the countries that were affected, which were most of them, the hospitals couldn't cope with this, the medical profession didn't have anything to offer, and that is in part why so many people died. However, research has shown that for generations afterwards, 2 and 3 generations, it caused damage to social trust. That is, to people trusting in the institutions of authority, government, the media, the healthcare system. And it was only at the end of the 20th century that that began to be repaired. Why do I mention that today? Well, as we'll talk about in a minute, that is important in the context of the coronavirus and whether we are going to have this as an outcome of the current pandemic. Another pandemic that I want to draw your attention to is the AIDS pandemic. We are all aware probably that the first cases of AIDS were observed in 1981, but I'm sure that most of us are not aware that AIDS is pandemic in the world today. We rarely hear about it. It has not gone away. In fact, there are about 1 million new cases every year, and up to this point, about 76 million people have been infected and 33 million people have died. Thinking about those statistics, should we be worried about the coronavirus? I don't know. Perhaps we need to think about the comparative severity of these diseases. But the fact is that AIDS is pandemic, we have no cure, and we only have limited treatments. This was an interesting instance of disease, however, because it caused enormous social change. Groups that had previously been highly stigmatized were acknowledged in the political and social environment, and they came to have much more of a place and a voice in society. It led directly to the formation of the gay rights movement. It also had enormous impact in the healthcare sector and led directly to new innovations in the screening of blood and organ supplies. It also changed infection control measures in healthcare and other settings. And when you think about infection control that you see around you in relation to the coronavirus, please remember it started because of the appearance of AIDS. It also had the effect of focusing political attention on social and economic injustices. Now, thinking about all of that, we come to the current COVID-19 pandemic. And this shows us more, perhaps, than we have seen before, that the impacts on history and society are very much magnified when we are living in a more globalized environment. It has been suggested that this period of pandemic has been accompanied by armed interstate conflicts all around the world, but we haven't paid attention to them because we're all focused on this disease. The restrictions on travel and the closure of borders are unprecedented. They have had serious economic impacts, but they're also impinging on individual rights. Things like this have not been done before. They are probably unconstitutional in many countries, but again, we haven't thought about it because we are focused on this disease. It has also been suggested by some observers that many nations are starting to prioritize their national security and their health status, and that this may lead to long-term restrictions on migration. And perhaps some countries will even begin to expel or restrict immigrants. Again, that would be unprecedented in the modern world and something that goes against many social principles that have been taken for granted in recent decades. Many populations around the world have also felt forced to alter their social and religious behavior. Again, unprecedented. I will point out to you that on the Hajj this year, only 1,000 people who already were in Saudi Arabia were allowed to participate. In ordinary years, that brings in 2 million travelers from around the world. That's an enormous difference and not one that we have seen before in the context of a health crisis or a health situation. In fact, some economists feel that the current situation is similar to the mass mobilization that was seen following World War I and World War II, but in reverse. People have been asked to stay at home. I know that most of us here are at home. I can see in the backgrounds that many of you are not at the office. I'm not at the office either. I haven't been there for 6 months. People have also been asked to give up wages. They've been asked to accept unacceptable levels of unemployment. in world wars, they were expected to enlist. Now we're expected to stay home for the common good. Government spending and debt pays for this directly to people or through employers. Again, that is similar to a military mobilization, a war footing. And there has also been a resource shift. Jobs have been lost, wages have been lost, but they have not been lost completely. They've shifted from certain sectors to others. There's hardly any activity in the tourism sector, for example, but logistics, for instance, has taken up a lot of that resource input. It is likely that recession may follow, as occurred after a number of 20th century wars. However, it is also likely that there will be social reforms, as there were in many nations. What we cannot ignore at this point, though, is where the social fault lines lie. And certainly in many countries, these have been exposed by the current coronavirus situation. And we have seen in many countries an enormous increase in mental health problems, domestic violence, drug and alcohol abuse, suicide, and other things of that kind. What this shows us is that the social factors we associate with health and illness in the context of public health are extremely important, and they are particularly important when there is some kind of public health emergency. So what's different today compared to the past? And again, looking at this from a public health point of view, you see that the human population is much bigger. That means population density is much higher. The number of people to infect one another is much greater. Attitudes, and perhaps more importantly, people's expectations about disease are different. This is because of public health measures as well as innovations in medical and pharmaceutical technology. At the same time, the healthcare system has undergone a shift in focus. We now think mostly about chronic disease management, and we have seen that healthcare systems around the world have been completely unprepared to deal with an epidemic of infectious disease. It is also the case that social media that's available to basically everyone has eroded trust and authority in media, in government, in the healthcare establishment. If you think these things sound familiar, yes, they are. They are very similar to what we experienced after the influenza pandemic in 1918. Regardless of that, many people seem to be unaware that disease is always present. We need to remember that even as we are focused on the coronavirus, there are at this moment outbreaks of other diseases that are much more serious. Seasonal influenza even accounts for thousands of deaths each year, but we accept this, it's usual, and we don't pay attention. Society was very obviously at a tipping point when COVID-19 appeared, and that is why the reaction has been so extreme and so exaggerated. Well, what can we conclude from all of this? Well, there are a couple of lessons we might learn, and what we might say is that there are certain things we could expect in the future. They include a change in the nature and intensity of political conflict, increasing distrust in the authority of government, widespread acceptance, perhaps, of superstition and fake news. I know this is a big problem in many parts of the world. Xenophobia and scapegoating, new economic winners and losers, a disproportionate impact on certain demographics as opposed to others. We have been reluctant to admit that one, but it has already been seen, and collective shock that will likely be expressed through new cultural forms. Now I'm going to end there. I've probably gone a little bit over my allotted time.
No, you are in time.
Now, but if you want to contact me, you can see the information there and the organizers have it. So I will thank you for that. And I certainly appreciate you being here today. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Rebecca Fanani. That's really very informative and very interesting presentation. We really appreciate your busy time for being with us this morning among your very, very busy schedule. Now we come to the question and answer sessions. So if you like to ask the presenters some questions, please do. And please write your question in the chat box, and then the host will share it, and I'm going to read. So also the Professor Pauls will be able to answer that also. Okay, here are some questions for Professor Hans Pauls and Professor Rebecca Fanani. Okay, can we start with the first one? Okay, the first slide, please. Okay, I'm going to read this. Based on your long historical research, particularly in medicine history, could you make calculation when this pandemic will lay down or end? This is for Professor Hans Pols. You can answer that, please. Professor Pols?
Yes.
Yeah.
Predict when it will be over. Well, hey, I'm a historian. I'm not a futurologist, right? Look, well, we are pretty much in the second wave. One could, I don't know if Indonesia is at the tail end of the first wave or if it's the second wave. Look, this is impossible to predict. Epidemics like cholera keep coming back time and again, or used to, not anymore. The Spanish flu had a very big second wave and a much smaller first wave. Everyone's talking about a vaccine. A vaccine would be terrific. But with the flu is that once we have the flu, we are immune for about 3-4 months, and then it wears off. If that is the case with COVID-19, then a vaccine would be useful for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. So we need to get an annual vaccination. So there are too many questions open. Generally, with epidemic disease, you see genetic mutations make it less powerful. If that is going to happen, it will just disappear, but it might take a while. We're not there yet. If there's a vaccine, depending on the nature of COVID and the immunity it conveys, it would be very effective, or it is just temporarily effective. For me, as a historian, I immediately get a social justice question. Once there is a vaccine, who gets it? Americans, Europeans, Australians, and maybe at some point Indonesians. I hope that this is based on justice and on where the disease is the most severe, not on nationality. But we also see that the vaccine is becoming a political issue. Vladimir Putin in Russia said, I already have a vaccine. Well, that's impossible, but it looks good. Trump wants to have a vaccine before the election and is pressuring health officials to say, okay, just say it's good. It doesn't work that way. So I wish I could say, let's say, I hope very much that 5 years from now, we can look back to this episode and say, oh, it was terrible, but it's over. Let's hope for the best.
Okay, thank you, Professor Paul. Now let's come to the second slide. Could you please put it out? Okay. Question number 2, Professor Paul. COVID-19 has make really people very scared in the world, and any level of the country is really worried about that. And the victim of the COVID increases every day, and it seems that we did not have any historical route to deal with it. And I think in this context, historical notes are very important to bring out from the facts from the past. Yeah, but unfortunately, our government just called doctors to contribute, and then not historians. So what a pity. What government of his apparatus talking, history of the nation is often becomes very basic, and basic in their speech, but they don't trust historian could contribute to this pandemic today. And could you please give your opinion on it?
I couldn't agree more. Now, as far as COVID is concerned, the closest epidemic or pandemic is, of course, the Spanish flu. So let's all vote to appoint Ravando to the Ministry of Health as a special advisor on the management of COVID, because that would really help very much. I'm not sure how much the Indonesian government is listening to the doctors. Of course, they're listening, but well, that's the question. According to physicians, they would say, lock everything down. That's not feasible. So there are several other considerations that politicians need to talk about. Yes, I completely agree. A historical perspective would be unusually helpful. And there are historians of medicine, physicians who are interested in the history of medicine, who could be really wonderful in giving some kind of advice here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pauls. Now we go to the next one. Actually, this question for Ibu Rebecca, but this is the next question for both of you. Menurut Bapak dan Ibu, so okay, sangat perlu diperhatikan. So according to both of you, that it is very important to pay attention to health. And if we look at the pandemic era, what do you think about this health concern? And because so as we know that in Asia, specifically in Indonesia, this pandemic is the cause of this pandemic in Indonesia because of the gathering, and then most of them are students who do this, and because they have their own reason. Could you please give suggestion how to give solution to this problem?
Is Bu Rebecca still there? Because
yeah, I'm just wondering whether Ibu Rebecca is here because I cannot see. I think she has left because there is a meeting. She has a meeting. Yeah. Okay. I think you are in charge to answer this question, Professor Paul.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, it's one important thing to consider that people, let's say between 16 and 30, love to socialize, love to hang out with their friends. Well, people over 60 are just happy to sit at home. So, yes, probably young people might be important vectors, and they also have the benefit they're not terribly badly affected in comparison. Now, we need to transcend a perspective of blame and praise. We can say culprits, the young people are guilty. Look, this is not helping very much. What would help is to think about, okay, younger people like to hang out. They are very social in their orientation. Let's think of ways how we can do this while decreasing the dangers of contagion. You go shopping. I love yoga. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
One disadvantage of giving a talk from home is that people at home. So yes.
Well, you're at home. Okay, so I'm just going to read the next question. This is also okay. This is also for both Professor Pauls and Professor Fanani. For the I'm Febriani from History Department at University. Looking at the many pandemics in the past that Mrs. Rebecca and Professor Holtz presented, what can we do as historians to fight the COVID-19 pandemic that is currently hitting us?
Good question. In general, not just historians, what we can do is, first of all, make the correct information available, right? Fighting misinformation is always central, always very important. And I think historians are in a very good position to identify misinformation because, hey, we have seen this before, so to say, or we know about what happened in the past. That can be a very good innovation. Secondly, what I mentioned before is to think about possible innovations. What can be done? Now, one really good innovation is, I think, in mosques at praying time, number of people allowed in is limited. Everybody wears the face mask. These very simple measures can be applied in many situations. And third measure, not just for historians, for everybody, is that staying at home for some people is a bit of a nightmare. Yeah, we love our kids to death, but spending 24 hours a day with them might be a bit too much of a good thing. Some people might get very isolated. We need to think of alternate ways to maintain a sense of community with our family, with our friends, with other people. And I guess young people know all about social media, and social media can be really used in a very innovative way to do that.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, we have to like think about alternate ways. Yeah, Professor Pauls, how to like cope with this hard time for all of us. Okay, the next question. Could you please like show me the next question? Okay. Okay, my question is, can you explain the kind and example of hoax and fake cures that happened in the past, and how the government and stakeholders counter with those hoax and fake cures?
Well, the Black Death in Europe, I mentioned, right? It was always blamed on the Jews poisoning the wells. And in European society, because the Jewish people were a small minority, they were the most loved people to blame for everything. With cholera, Europeans said, oh, it must be the Muslims who bring it.
No, yeah.
So hoaxes today. So in the United States, we have preachers saying it's the gay people who do it, or it's the people who have left the church, or it's the people who live in sin. Define living in sin as you please. This is not helping. This is scapegoating. This is creating division and separation. First of all, it's medically completely inaccurate, so it's based on nothing at all. But secondly, even if it's inaccurate, the social effects of this kind of blaming are very damaging. And as Rebecca already said, it leads to a decrease of trust in social institutions, in your fellow human being, in medicine. This is one thing that historians can do, but academics or everybody, is to fight that kind of apportioning blame.
Okay, do we have some more questions?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is for Ibu Rebecca actually. Is Ibu Rebecca still here with us? If not, I think we can skip that question and send it to Ibu Rebecca, I guess. Okay, now, according to Professor Pauls and Professor Fanani, so what do you think about the paramedics and doctors who have been infected by the COVID-19, although they have been wearing the appropriate health protection for themselves? What kind of suggestion does Professor Hans have for this kind of problem that the nurses and the
It's not just the doctors. It is indeed also the nurses, paramedics, or people who take care of sick people at home.
Yeah.
That so many of them is absolutely terrible. Well, first of all, there has been in Indonesia, worldwide, they have like, oh, these doctors, they just want to make a high income and be comfortable. This pandemic shows that doctors will fight for the patients, whatever it takes. And some of them have died as a consequence. So I think this brings to me a new respect and appreciation for our doctors who stand in the line of fire at the front lines fighting this disease. Secondly, some of them have been wearing protective equipment, but worldwide and specifically in Indonesia, there's a severe shortage of it. And this makes me very angry about the Indonesian government, because it has been very slow to react and very slow to get this protective equipment. One should not sacrifice our doctors, our paramedics unnecessarily. They are prepared to fight. They should get all the assistance they need in form of protective agreements and stuff like that. Sadly, the head of the Ministry of Health, Dr. Terra, once said in the beginning, what is it, eat well and pray and it will be fine. But that was just complete medical misinformation. That should never have happened. It's kind of sad that the people who we respect and look up to tell us the wrong thing.
Yeah. Okay, can we have the next question, please? Okay. Okay. Now we can like reflect from the Black Death. Then its relation to the perspective that is not really scientific is kind of like voodoo or magic in this case. Like now we look at what we have with us now in Indonesia, the COVID-19, and some people might say, why should we afraid? And then we are going to die anyway. Then just keep going to the mosque and without carrying, or wearing the mask and the following the health protocols. And why do these people do that, and why is it happening now? And then why do we have this kind of unscientific thinking? And then the government also makes some statement which is not really scientific.
Look, these are the hardest questions we are dealing with worldwide. In Australia, in the United States, the people say, I will refuse to wear a face mask. It's against my human rights. Yeah, I mean, gosh. The thing that I find most objectionable about that is it says, it is my right. You wear a face mask to protect others, not just to protect yourself. So a basic social feeling should be, what can I do to prevent the spread? How can I prevent myself becoming a super spreader? I think that is the most important thing. And in this respect, we see this epidemic bringing people's true nature. If they always portray themselves as caring for other people, and now they say, no, I will draw the line right here. Well, you get to know some people much better than you've ever did before. And yeah, that can be quite unfortunate. Look, what are we going to do? In the United States, in Australia, people try to argue and reason with people like that. This is generally not very effective. Then there are people who say the whole thing is a hoax, right? It's just a way of the government to assert control. Or when there's a vaccine, it's Bill Gates who wants to put through the vaccine a chip that can control all our movements. Like, these ideas are everywhere. And maybe this is our best challenge, or our most important challenge, to think about as historians, sociologists, anthropologists, everybody. How come these kind of beliefs that are so obviously untrue and so obviously crazy, how come there are so many people who say, there's something to that? And I always start saying, I did my own research. Like, The web, the World Wide Web is, of course, carries so much misinformation that you can always find a conspiracy about everything. And we are not inclined to say, well, we should shut down the World Wide Web, or we should shut down some sites. Facebook is now shutting down some pages that spread misinformation. One of the other tasks, specifically for academics, is persistently to make that correct information available.
Yeah, correct information. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Pauls. Now, can we have? Do we still have some more questions? Okay, this is from Rahmat Nurfialdi from the History of Department at Untitled University. He would like to hear your opinion. During this pandemic, there have been many issues spread out, and it's for the sake of business. I also heard that hospitals say that the patients are infected, and then they are paid by the hospital so they can get more money. And it's also said that there has been news that vaccine is going to be sold, and then with very quite approachable price. And then what do you think about this, Professor Pauls, that these issues, the vaccine will be available, but the patients also has been got this result saying that they are positive?
Well, this question illustrates very much what Ibu Rebecca said about the loss of trust in public institutions during and following a pandemic. The hospitals only want to fill themselves up so they can claim money and to get wealthy. The vaccine will be expensive just because people want to make money out of it. There is a risk that it will be. there is a distinct risk. Let's hope for the best. There are forces, politicians in this world who say we need to avoid this at all cost. One thing we have seen in Indonesia, we all know the very sad story of the first 2 patients, right? They were identified by name and address. They were kicked out of the neighborhood. The woman was, I think, a yoga teacher or dance teacher, and immediately on the web was like, "Oh, who the hell has she slept with? She must be so immoral." This is a panic reaction, and this is what we need to avoid. And we need to band together to fight this kind of stuff, because of course, chasing 2 patients out of the neighborhood makes them super spreaders. They should stay at home. And people who get sick, like if I get the measles or whatever, you can blame me, but it's not helping. It's not helping. So look, I think the question indicates indeed a growing distrust against pretty much everything. Sadly, sometimes this is justified. The American pharmaceutical industry is for profit. That means that medications are very slow to make it to countries like Indonesia because they're unaffordable. With the AIDS epidemic, retroviral and medications that were able to stop the development of symptoms of AIDS were too expensive for African nations. So people were just dying even though there was a medication. Sadly, this is part and parcel of neoliberalism and capitalism. And I think this COVID epidemic allows us to raise the question, is this the best way to do things? In case of health, in case of pharmaceuticals, maybe it's not. Should we think about better ways of doing this that are more just, social justice? And again, answering still that first or second question, this is where academics, historians, political scientists can play a central role. Trying to, as Boer Rebecca said, the AIDS epidemic was of course terrible, but there were many very positive social benefits out of this. Let's focus on the potential positive social benefits that can come out of COVID. Let's start building them now.
Very interesting answer, Professor Pauls. Do we have some more questions? If not, actually, if you allow me, I would like to ask you a question.
Well, you can, right? You're the boss.
If there is no other question from the participant, I would like to ask you a question. Professor Pauls, I'm interested about the hoax and the you touched a little bit about religions, how the religious people or the religious leaders handles and spread out also, some hoax, or because they believe that this is from God. And then if we keep, going to the mosque, we will die anyway. So from the perspective of historians, what about in Rome, in Italy, that pandemic, and also Spanish people are also, we're known as religious people as well. I'm just wondering whether you have accounted to that kind of, preachers, priests deal with this kind of pandemics in the past.
In the past and in the present, we see from all religions a very different responses, right? Some people say, okay, we need to adapt. Hey, I think the Minangkabau area was the area of Islamic renewal in Indonesia from Islamic modernism, thinking science and Islam are compatible. Science is a way from God to teach us about the world. Let's act on it. There are, of course, very different approaches as well. I think it was a Tahrir Islam, a group that had a meeting in Malaysia, and then just before it was held in Makassar, it was stopped because the Malaysia event became a super spreading event. So I don't know if they ignored all kind of warnings. So yes, there are churches in the United States who say, well, God is with us, so we are going to hold a church service anyway. But there are also many other churches who say, well, we need to adapt, and we can, just like our conference, we can host our church service live. There are many ways to be religious, and religion is a powerful force. It can be used for people's benefit and also to damage people. If people say we are going to die anyway, well, that's very true. And if you are in the mood to bring your death earlier, that's up to you. I mean, we are not going to fight that.
Yeah.
But I think the death of other people, if you can make sure that that is not affected, I think that is a basic impulse of caring about other people. And that is a basic value in all religions. Right? Don't do damage. I mean, ideally, of course, do good unto thou fellow human beings. But often we say, well, if you don't do any damage, maybe that's a good start.
Thank you very much, Professor Pauls. Now, there is another question here. The difference in response of course, related to rational thinking and beliefs held by citizens in policy practice, there are still positive responses, but also negative one. What is happening today, in fact, also happened during the Dutch colonial period in Indonesia, which also had a negative response in the face of the influenza epidemic and pandemic. This negative response is mainly related to the occurrence of conflict of interest, both individuals and institutions. As a result, there is a disagreement in dealing with the eradication of the pandemic's outbreak. And it even seeps into other unrelated fields. What solution can we propose to this problem? From Nofri Yasman, Andalas University, Professor Pauls?
Well, what solution can we propose? In colonial times, the colonial administration and the health department would say, this is the solution, and we just do it. In today, the nature of democracy means we need to have a public discussion about this. And governments need to be clear and very open about why they make certain decisions. The biggest conflict of interest today is in the interest of the economy and the interest of health. And sadly, we cannot shut down the economy until the pandemic is over, because then we would all starve. We need a functioning economy, even if we should allow it to function at a lower degree. If these discussions are had publicly, if politicians explain, these are our considerations and these are our decisions, that would be a great way forward. Now that's surely not the style of politics we see in a lot of places. Not quite in Indonesia, not quite in the United States. Depends. Some countries are much better at than others. If the government is not doing it, I think academics can step in and just explain things. And that will make clearer. Look, there are always conflicts of interest. The question is, how are they managed? How open are we? Economic interest, people prefer to keep them hidden because it doesn't make them look good. Well, sometimes we cannot do that.
Yeah. I think we are about to need to wrap up this very informative, very interesting presentation of Professor Pauls. To wrap up, I would just to emphasize what we can conclude from our today's discussion, that this pandemic, or we learn from the unknown diseases that have we learned from the past, and then the current issues related to the impact of this pandemic and the problem that we are facing, but regarding the scapegoating, distrust, but we still have to find alternative ways how to deal with this pandemic. So in the future, we can make it better, learn and then improve into the better ways in the future. Again, I want to thanks a million to Professor Pauls and also to Ibu Rebecca, our great presenter this morning. We really appreciate your time among your busy schedules. Thank you very much to all the participants for joining us this morning. Icon Health webinar as the moderator. I'm sorry if I'm kind of make mistake during this duty. Thank you very much again, Professor Paul. We hope we can see. I mean, I would like to, we all here can't wait to meet you in Padang if the pandemic is over. Well, it's not going to be really over, but there is this vaccine and with affordable price supposed to be. We are looking forward, and then the Minang Batik is waiting for you here, and also Padang food.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Falls. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to hand it over to Ibu Ninarni as the chairperson for this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Dia. Thank you for the interesting discussion, Pak Han and Ibu Rebecca, for sharing your knowledge for us. And we hope we can continue this collaboration in the other activity. Thank you also for the Dean, Festin, and all colleagues from various departments and from the Faculty of Humanity who have given their support to the committee. And thank you also for the participants and colleagues from the various university and country who have attended this conference. And I will inform you that we still have a 2 more day discussion. Tomorrow we have Dr. Diah Pitaloka with interesting people, culture, community, organizing, and pandemic response. And Rovando, war against influence in the 1918 influence pandemic in colonial Indonesia, and Mr. Juprianto on grammar of history by the COVID-19 survivor, and Novel Alfiandri to escape from lion, the metaphorical farming of coronavirus in Minangkabau. Contact and Mbak Wahyu Suryani with the title From Military Health Service to Civil Policy, Portrait of for the COC, Bukit Tinggi Hospital in the colonial period also. And the third day you can listen from the Yop Bini, the doctor from the minority ethnic who living in USA, can tell about coronavirus 19 and Dega American in North Carolina, USA, and me, pandemic and local wisdom. We pleasure to wait you in the next day. And also don't forget to join with lecture series program in the beginning of November with Prof. Gusti Asnan, who will discuss about kreativitas berbahasa orang Minangkabau on 2 November 2020, and Ibu Amurwati Dwi Lestari Ningsih who talk about kisah-kisah penjara di Pelatungan. And once again, thank you very much for all who come to this conference, and especially for Pak Hans and Ibu Rebecca. I'm really experienced, and thank you very much. You share your knowledge for us, not only for us, for all people who watch this conference. And this is really important, not only for us as a docent, as a lecturer, and also for our students in Indonesia. We hope we can make a collaboration again in the next event. And also thank you for our colleagues, especially Ibu Dia, who helped us in this first day. And I do not know what I say because I'm really, really happy we can share our knowledge in this pandemic. Thank you very much, and see you in the next day still in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Paul.
Thank you, Pak Paul. Thank you, Pak Han. Terima kasih.
Sama-sama. Ya.
Have a nice afternoon, Professor Hans Paul. Permisi semua, terima kasih banyak semua.
Terima kasih Pak Hans. Terima kasih yang lain. Terima kasih
Pak Hans. Salam untuk Sydney University. Saya rindu Sydney University.
Thank you. See you and everybody. Thank you. See you in the next day. Thank you Pak Han.
Sampai jumpa lagi.
Sampai jumpa lagi.
Sampai jumpa lagi.